Hi, everybody. I believe you can hear me now. Welcome to the SAA webinar. We're going to get started here in about 4 minutes. So thanks for jumping on early, and we'll give the rest of our attendees some time before we get started. All right, we are at our start time, 1 o'clock Central. So thank you, everyone, for jumping on and joining SAA. I feel like a podcast host now because every time I do this, our audience keeps growing. And I'll have to say, I think that not to jinx us to start this, but I think this might be one of our best webinars yet, and very excited for the group of talented and experienced individuals that we have us. So thank you so much for joining us. Really looking forward to our aquaculture market outlook. For those of you just joining us or unfamiliar with SAA, my name is Easton Kaboshik. I serve as the executive director and have so for about 1.5 years now. It's a pleasure, and if there's anything I can do to support you, your knowledge and use of U.S. soy or the domestic aquaculture market, please don't ever hesitate to reach out. I will do everything I can or connect you to someone much wiser and smarter than me, such as the folks on the call today. So nice to connect with you. And my contact information will be on the very last slide at the end. So a few housekeeping things, just so you all know. If you've attended a webinar, you probably know this already, but as a reminder, you're muted. So if you disagree, we can't hear you, and that's perhaps intentional at times. This webinar is being recorded and will be available afterwards. So I can see the red flashing record button. We'll make sure that all this knowledge is captured for us to review and reflect on in the future. And then for questions, there's a Q&A function. It works a little bit better than the comment function because it goes directly to us as panelists, and then we can make sure to get those answered. We'll try to answer all the questions at the end, but if a really good one pops up during one of the presentations, we will try to answer that as well. So our agenda for today, I want to just acknowledge all the folks that make this possible, do a few introductions of who we're talking about, and then we're going to go from the broad scale to more narrow focused, starting with the global aquaculture market, the trends that we see around the world, and then try to translate to what's that really mean here in the US, and what's it mean to growers and to our market, and what are the biggest barriers. We were having a great conversation just as prepping for this call, and I think there's going to be a lot of really insightful things and a lot of different threads. So please don't be afraid to ask questions when those presentations are happening. And then we're going to go and translate it to the U.S. soy market. And what's that mean? What's the opportunity for aquaculture from soy's perspective? And then wrap up with Q&A. So talked about that, really our goals for today, and just discussing global aquaculture. Where are we at? Where are we heading? Where's the U.S. stand in aquaculture? What's that outlook, and what's it mean for growers? And then really talk about what the soybean industry is, what's happening in the soybean industry, and what impacts that'll have on the aquaculture industry overall. So overall, our audience, I think we had around 85 registrations again. Those are mostly, soybean industry. We have a lot of academic, a lot of aquaculture industry. I see Jesse Chappell's on there because he must be reminded, and he's already emailing me during this call, and a lot of other good folks. So thank you and welcome. And this is all made possible by soybean farmers. So I'd be remiss if I didn't say thank you to all of these state soybean associations, boards. They are truly farmer-led organizations that are contributing to aquaculture's success. They're the ones funding the research, they're the ones funding our market development, and they're the ones funding this great opportunity today. So thank you to farmers, and if you see your neighbor, tell him thank you as well. And then just a broader thank you and understanding. Sometimes there's some confusion. There's a lot of different organizations in the soy family, but I want to acknowledge just the alignment between overall U.S. soy and the different areas that we're working on. We have Mac Marshall here with us today with the United Soybean Board. We work closely with USEC, whose knowledge and expertise is spread all over the globe, and they're a great resource in aquaculture for our friends abroad. SAA is focused more on the research side and on domestic aquaculture market development. And then we have our friends working on policy and working on emerging markets and human health and the WISH program. So a broad family, a lot of resources, a lot of work happening from the soybean industry into aquaculture. So really quickly, I thought we do introductions, and I will not do anyone justice here. So I think if you don't mind, speakers or panelists, I'll have you give a brief background on who you are and how you got here today, or where you are today, for the benefit of our audience, and then jump right into your slides. So we have first Dr. Taryn Garlock, assistant professor at Auburn University. Welcome, Taryn. We have Dr. Carol Engel, adjunct faculty at Virginia Tech. And then, of course, our good friend, Mac Marshall, Vice President of Market Intelligence. What are your updates on LinkedIn, Mac? Markets with Mac?
Yeah, that's the monthly one. We got one on for August about the St. Lawrence Seaway, and what that means for the interconnectivity of inland waterway transport and how we move soy around. Brilliant.
Well, whoever asked the best question today can get an autographed hat from Mac.
The autograph will devalue it.
We'll devalue it. Perfect. All right, so we'll jump in, and Taryn, you are up first, and bear with me as I shift our slides here. I have all their faces in the way. Slideshow from start. All right. So Taryn, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself, and I will steer as you speak.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to speak today. So I'm Taryn Garlock. I'm an assistant professor at Auburn University, and I work primarily in fisheries and aquaculture economics. And so today I'm going to just kind of briefly talk about some of the major trends in global aquaculture production and markets. So let's jump right in. So globally, aquaculture is the fastest growing animal production sector. In the last 2 decades, it's grown at an average annual growth rate close to 5%. And so over this time, aquaculture production has nearly tripled in terms of volume, reaching about 93 million metric tons in 2022. And then in absolute terms, this growth is also pretty substantial, with an additional 2 to 3 million metric tons per year. And this growth in aquaculture has been driven by multiple factors, including globalization, the expansion of trade, and really, increasing demand for seafood associated with economic growth and rising wealth that couldn't be filled by stagnant wild production. But as this bottom right-hand figure shows, growth in aquaculture is slowing, and it's projected to slow further to an annual rate of about 1.7% during the next decade. And this is expected, due to the growing baseline as the industry is maturing, but also due to anticipated issues with disease, rising feed costs. We're also seeing China being particularly interested in environmental sustainability, and there's potentially new environmental policies and regulations that might lower their productivity. All right, so next. So in the last couple of decades, we've seen diversification of production, and this has largely, been led by China in response to changing local demand as their wealth has increased. And this has led to a declining market share for these low-value carp species, and increased market share for other higher value species. So this figure, the bar plot here, shows that the top produced species, and you can see, the strongest production growth has been in marine finfish and shrimp, both of which are relatively high value products and currently require high levels of protein in the diet. This is followed by oysters, obviously not being fed, and then freshwater fishes, including catfish and tilapia, where the majority of production requires feeds. Next, please. And in fact, what we do see is when we look at the shares of fed versus non-fed aquaculture, is that fed aquaculture dominates. It makes up about 73% of global aquaculture production. And we see that, over this time series, growth in fed aquaculture, has substantially outpaced non-fed aquaculture. And what this indicates is that there is much higher market demand for fed aquaculture products. And it's also indicative that, in general, producers have been able to overcome the challenges associated with feeds, such as feed cost. And we, expect that this trend to continue, where fed aquaculture continues to gain market share. And this is for a number of reasons. We've seen feed use increase in freshwater aquaculture, where historically feeds were not used. We're also seeing aquaculture becoming more intensive. We're seeing this, more broadly with food production systems, as, it's necessary to feed our growing population. And so these more intensive systems, are having a higher output, per unit area, but they're also requiring increases in feed use, as well as increased energy use per unit of fish being produced. And then we're also seeing, strong interest in the expansion of mariculture, as well as land-based recirculating culture, especially in places like China, Europe, and the US. And this is primarily focused on high-value carnivorous species such as salmon, the large yellow croaker in China, sea bass and sea bream, and other higher trophic level species. Next. And so China is a key player in the global seafood market. And China is responsible for about 57% of aquaculture production. And as I said earlier, production growth in China is expected to slow due to potential environmental regulations. And so we expect that China will lose a little bit of market share, but this market share will likely be absorbed in other parts of South and Southeast Asia, where growth in aquaculture is very high. And so to achieve, China's level of production, they're using about 42% of global fish meal. And then they're also using about 26% of global oilseed meals. That's for aquaculture and other animal protein. But not only is China a major producer, it's also a major consumer. And so China consumes about 70 million metric tons of seafood each year, which ends up being about 40% of global seafood production. And just for comparison, the US is consuming about 8.5 million metric tons of seafood per year. And so demand for seafood in China, is growing faster than production due to their rising middle class. And in recent years, we've seen imports have continued to grow while exports of seafood have declined. And so we can expect that, imports are going to be important for meeting China's demand for seafood in years to come. Next. And so seafood trade, has increased very rapidly as aquaculture production has grown. About a third of seafood is traded, making it one of the most highly traded commodities. We've seen increased control of the aquaculture production process, really facilitate development of downstream services such as processing, freezing, distribution, and logistics that are needed for international trade. And we've also seen that growth in traded value has grown much faster than growth in traded volumes, which indicates a higher share of traded seafood is, higher value species, as well as value-added product forms. And therefore, it's not too surprising that high and, middle-income economies are the major seafood importers, including the US, China, Japan, and some of the European countries. So this increase, can you go back 1 second? Yeah, so increased trade, of seafood, as well as, growth in aquaculture has really facilitated commoditization of the seafood market. And so domestic and international markets for the major species groups like salmon, shrimp, tuna, and whitefish, those markets are highly integrated, and there's a global price determination process. And what we've seen as the farm share of production increases for a species, we see that production costs, the aquaculture production cost becomes increasingly important in the price determination. So for instance, the input costs of salmon aquaculture really drives the price of farmed salmon as well as the price of wild salmon. All right, you can go to the next one. Okay, and so in the late 2000s up into the early 2010s, there was a significant increase in the real price of aquaculture products. And this largely mirrors the increase in fish meal price, which I'll show in a minute. We also see, price surge around 2021, 2022, associated with a strong post-COVID rebound. Demand increased very rapidly. Supply, was still somewhat subdued due to the pandemic. And we also saw, an upward cost pressure on the supply side due to increasing costs for feed, as well as for energy. Okay, next, please. So there are a number of critical bottlenecks for, sustained aquaculture growth. Feed availability and feed cost are a couple of these. We've seen the global supply of marine ingredients is static while production of oilseed meals has been increasing. And it's projected that there will be a slight increase in fish meal production in the next decade. And this is primarily associated with increased use of fish waste and as well as byproducts from processing. And so currently about 27% of fish meal is coming from byproducts. And this is expected to increase, but not enough to offset the rising, aquaculture demand for protein. Next, please. And so early in this time series here, fish meal was primarily used in swine and poultry production. It was relatively inexpensive. And then later on in the time series, we're seeing growing demand from aquaculture, coupled with the limited supply from stagnating capture fisheries, really increased the price of fish meal in the 2000s. Fish meal price nearly doubled as an increasing share of fish meal was consumed by aquaculture. And so it was really this increased demand for fish meal by the aquaculture sector that drove up the price of fish meal. And by the time the price peaked in the early 2010s, about 3/4 of fish meal was being consumed by aquaculture. And since then, the price of fish meal has remained consistently higher than soybean meal. And it's also interesting to point out that there is much more volatility in fish meal prices, and this is due to the El Nino events and fluctuating catches in reduction fisheries. And so as demand for fish meal is expected to increase in the future and the supply is relatively limited, this is expected to put upward pressure on prices and create further incentives for innovations in aquaculture feeds. And the price of soybean meal has been relatively stable across that time series, despite the increases in production that I previously showed, suggesting that this is going to be a relatively low-cost substitute. And so the use of fish meal is both an economic concern and a sustainability concern, and aquaculture producers have responded to this by reducing fish meal in their feed formulations. And so Norwegian salmon is one example where there's been more than a 70% decline in the use of marine source programs over the last 30 years, and this correlated with a near doubling in vegetable sourced proteins. And so this is true for many species, including shrimps and some marine fin fishes, as well as the freshwater fin fishes that I showed earlier would have substantial production growth in recent years. So for many of the freshwater fin fishes, fish meal inclusion has dropped to pretty low levels, 1 to 3%. However, even though these are very low inclusion rates, production volumes for these species are so large that it ends up being a substantial portion of global fish meal use. So fed carps are estimated to consume more than 1/4 of global fish meal. Tilapia is estimated to consume about 18%, shrimp about 15%, marine fishes is currently at 8%, but we'll expect to see these increase as we see growth in these species. All right, so next. So just to quickly recap, China is going to continue to play a significant role as a major consumer, producer, importer of fish and feed ingredients. And because of trade and globalization, they're going to have a strong influence on the global seafood market and trade. And of course, this is going to have implications for the U.S. market. Demand, for aquaculture feeds is going to increase as production continues to grow, and importantly, as demand for higher value and higher trophic species continues to grow. And so we're going to see increased substitution of marine ingredients, with lower cost alternatives, including plant-based alternatives. And this is going to be possible through, innovation, improvements in breeding, better understanding the nutritional needs of the fish, and improvements in feed formulations. And this is really important to lower feed costs and overall production costs, because like I had shown previously, the production costs is really important in price determination. And lowering the cost of seafood strengthens the competitiveness of seafood as a food source and as an animal protein source. All right, so just thank you for being here, for listening, and I'll hand it back to Easton now.
Thank you, Taryn. While we have you, though, there is one question from Corey. Are these trends similar between fresh and saltwater aquaculture?
So we're seeing, in terms of absolute growth in freshwater aquaculture is much higher. But we're seeing that marine aquaculture is having much more rapid growth in relative terms.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, Carol, you ready? You're still on mute.
You'd think I'd remember to do that by now. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Oops. All right, can everybody see my screen there now?
We can.
You can? All right. Well, by way of introduction, my name is Carol Engel, and I'd like to extend greetings to everybody and thank you all for joining and participating here today. Basically, my career involved 27 years in Arkansas, where I served as the department chair and director of the Aquaculture Fisheries Center, and had the tremendous opportunity to work very closely with fish farmers in the state of Arkansas, many of whom were and are pioneers in growing their respective sectors. And I learned a tremendous amount about what it takes to have not just a viable business, but to grow entire sectors like catfish and baitfish and hybrid striped bass from those leaders and those individuals. As many of you know, I view aquaculture through the lens of economics and marketing, but in business development and what it takes to be a viable, successful aquaculture business in the U.S. and around the world. I retired with my husband about 8 years ago, and we relocated to the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. So we're in a rural area, and hopefully our internet that's not broadband is going to hold up for this webinar. But when we did, we formed a little consulting company, but then Virginia Tech also offered me an adjunct faculty appointment very kindly. And so I've continued to follow research and extension and outreach efforts and work with U.S. aquaculture farmers since then. So what I'm going to do here today is really a mix of things. And my intent really is to cover some very broad topics and really sort of as a teaser for the Q&A session, because I'm not sure exactly what interests all of you bring to ask some questions about things. So I'm going to first talk some about U.S. aquaculture and talk about some of the growth areas. Where are the areas of growth that will provide the greatest demand for U.S. soy products in the United States from my perspective? But then I can talk about some very broad market trends in the short term, and then some long-term thoughts about what it's going to take to really get U.S. aquaculture to achieve its true potential in this country. Well, I think just glancing through who's participating, I don't have to tell you that aquaculture in the U.S. is diverse, it's complex. Every state in the United States has some form of aquaculture. We raise more than 400 species in the United States. It's just really, really quite phenomenal and endlessly fascinating as well. But when we talk about aquaculture in the U.S. and we dial down and zero in on food fish, which is where the feed is fed, of course, is the food fish, not the shellfish. When we look at this and we look at what the most important species are, and we think about where the feed is being fed, the majority of it, we have to talk about catfish. And there's no question, it's the biggest sector of U.S. aquaculture. And if we want to grow demand for U.S. soybeans in the United States, we need to help the catfish industry grow and support the U.S. catfish industry. There's no question about it. Nutritionists who work in catfish nutrition, realized decades ago that catfish do very, very well digesting soybean meal, and so they switched diets to primarily soybean meal from fish meal decades ago. Catfish industry does not get the credit it really does deserve for feeding very sustainable feeds, and they have for a very, very long time. Now, the catfish industry, as the leading sector, as will happen with any sector that grows and becomes successful in the United States, attracted competition, as all of you know, and that is what will happen and is happening with every other successful sector. The U.S. is a major seafood market, and so it attracts that kind of attention. The catfish industry, by rights, maybe could have folded up and just died, but it didn't do that. It reinvented itself. And a lot of it was through a lot of research funding, but a lot of on-farm kind of work, a lot of work between research and extension folks in the catfish industry. And what they've done is reinvented themselves by becoming more intensive. They've essentially tripled their yields, which is no small feat whatsoever for a major industry, but have essentially tripled the yields in terms of pounds per acre by adopting two major technologies: intensively aerating ponds and also the split pond systems that you see in front of you there. They've been able to do this and reduce their costs and became competitive again in doing so. So again, further advances in addressing their ongoing kinds of things that emerge in this industry, without a doubt, is the fastest way to grow demand for U.S. aquaculture. This industry does have growth potential and is one that warrants the support that we can provide to this particular industry. If we move past catfish in terms of these other food fish sectors, tilapia is the next largest sector, and then hybrid striped bass. The salmon data are suppressed for confidentiality reasons in the Census of Aquaculture, but they'd likely fall right in there between hybrid striped bass and redfish and sturgeon and other species. I'm going to, in the interest of time here today, just mention a couple of sectors that I think are just show the kind of exciting potential for growth that we have in the United States and that have shown some real growth in recent years. If in the Q&A you're interested in the kinds of things constraining any one of these species-specific sectors, I'd be happy to talk about it. As you know, 8-9 years with a group of colleagues, including Ganesh Kumar and Jonathan Van Senten, we've surveyed 74% of the entire aquaculture industry in the U.S., talking with them and listening carefully to what is needed and what their major issues are. The specifics differ across sectors, but I'm happy to share that with you all. We had tremendous response rates on those surveys. But let me talk about some real growth areas and real success stories. In the United States, we have our major finfish industry is salmon, but we have a second one of redfish that is a really interesting success story. Nearly all redfish are farmed in the U.S. They're farmed in ponds along the coast in Texas. This industry and the knowledge of how to raise redfish has been around for many, many years. But look what's happened between the 2005 and 2018 census. This is phenomenal growth. Now, how did this happen when people did know how to farm redfish before 2005? Why did it take off, and why has it become so successful? Now, redfish is a native fish. There was an established market for wild-caught redfish, but that doesn't mean that there's a market for farmed redfish. As everybody who's in business knows, a market and a sale happens when one buyer and one seller get together and they agree on a quantity and a price. And those marketing relationships are absolutely vital. If you look at the history of the U.S. catfish industry, the bait fish industry, there were some very savvy businessmen that came in after people knew how to raise these species, but they knew how to put these pieces together and talk with buyers and listen to their buyers and develop markets even for species that are well known in that area. And that's what happened with redfish. And so you can point to a time when some of these folks got into the redfish industry, but they knew how to develop markets, and they devoted the time to develop a market for their farm product. Just because people eat redfish and buy it does not mean that there's a particular business. It took individuals to really devote years of effort to do this and to develop this. It's a real success story. And they've had their challenges and they've been hit with some weather events and had losses. But the other thing that the redfish sector did for U.S. aquaculture was that they went to FSA and made the case not just for redfish, but all U.S. aquaculture to be included in ELAP. Major day, and hats off to the redfish farmers for doing it, but they did it on the base of their success in developing an entire sector like this. Another really interesting success story in the United States in recent years is this one, is sturgeon. And I've learned fairly recently that the research done to close the life cycle on sturgeon was all done in the United States. And a lot of it was done through funding from the Western Regional Aquaculture Center. That was done many years ago. Now, sturgeon, of course, are raised in several states in the United States. California is the big one that took the lead in many respects. Sturgeon are sold into caviar markets and meat markets, and also are sold as live fish into live food fish markets. That's quite interesting. Look at this graph, what's done in recent years. Now, some of that delay in the sturgeon industry taking off in the United States, some of that delay is because one of these fish to reach, the size when you can get eggs from it, it's 8 years. And so there's that lag in there. But look at this kind of growth rate, 21 to 22, 26% growth. So we have sectors that have grown. I'm not saying that there aren't issues that the sturgeon industry is facing where they need some help as well, but this is another success story. And it shows what can be done in the United States with U.S. aquaculture, and they're really good examples of it. Marine finfish is an area of real potential growth. And while there was a time, maybe 10 years ago, I would have thought it would never happen in the United States, we're starting to see it happen. Between Kona, Kampachi, and Hawaii, there is a permit with all the challenges and everything else going on in the Gulf Coast. But we may see something happen there. And there is at least one indoor wrasse pompano farm in Florida and some others. So this is a growth area. We've got to deal with the regulatory constraints in the marine environment, but there has been progress. NOAA's working on aquaculture opportunity areas, and there's some evidence that this may be opening up to the U.S. that has tremendous potential to expand marine finfish production in the United States. And redfish is sort of a model as to how it could take off sooner rather than later, because they're already in those markets and they already have ponds and they're interested in diversifying their production. So those are just a couple of quick examples of real success stories. And what I do want to do back a little bit, because we have to put all of this in the context of what's happening around the world. When I think of the word market, I think in a very broad level. A market is, to me, and the way I look at these things, much more than just a place to go sell your fish or shrimp that you've raised. It's this whole set of interaction and the intersection between what's going on across all the farms and what consumers are willing and able to pay and where they get it and everything else in between. So I want to step back just very briefly and talk about some short-term trends. Buyers and sellers make these choices that result in a sale or not a sale in the broad context of what's going on with government policy, international trade, pandemics, and all sorts of things. And we could talk for hours about this. And anyone in the Q&A who wants to come back to this or any of these issues, there's a lot to talk about. But I'm going to try to be very brief in some comments about a couple of real key issues. What's happening in the United States and in the EU and many countries around the world, we can't deny it. Now, to put it in context, it's not new to the United States or any other country in the world. What is new is that our rates of inflation, with a very strong economy that we had for many years going into the pandemic, the inflation rates were very low. So what's new is these higher rates of inflation. Now, that's what's happening in the United States. China's different. China has deflation. And we can talk about that and what that might mean in China. If I had to choose between inflation and deflation, I would choose inflation. Deflation is a decline in prices, which may sound like a good thing, but it's not. And if anybody wants to come back to that, China has some economic issues with a contraction in their economy, 21% unemployment of their young folks, and other sorts of things. And China being the huge producer and consumer of seafood, what happens in China affects the rest of the world. But let's come back to the United States. So inflation in the United States, feed prices are going up, and they've gone up by a lot. That makes it difficult to manage a farm. I've spent a lot of time talking with farmers about how to try to approach this on their individual farms and how to deal with increasing feed prices. Everything else is going up too. It's not just feed. And so rising costs are a huge issue right now in the United States. And the United States is doing what it needs to do to reduce inflation. And the rate has come down, but it's still too high, which means costs are still going to go up through 2023, probably into 2024. But our government and the Federal Reserve Board is doing what it needs to do, but it's painful to get this under control. And what they're doing is raising interest rates. Well, what that means for farmers, they know what it means. The interest payments on their operating loans have all gone up. It means that to take out a loan to make an investment or make an improvement is going to cost a whole lot more money. The other thing that people don't think about as much is that now there are also opportunities for investors. So when interest rates were very low, because inflation was very low for many years, there were not a lot of good opportunities for investors. So venture capitalists started pouring money into all kinds of other things. Now with higher interest rates, a lot of that investment capital is going into other instruments, and the venture capital kinds of startups are struggling to keep venture capital coming in. So this is sort of the broad context. But if you've talked with a farmer lately or any other business person, you've probably heard of labor shortages. All of this adds up to a lot of uncertainty, which is not a great thing for businesses in the short term. And I'm going to throw out something that I don't hear other people talking about, but I think there's a lot of fear in the world, not just in the US. We see human migration on a level we've not seen, not just into the US, but into the EU, wildfires and wars and everything else. And consumers that are afraid are not great for businesses and economies either. But I think there's a lot of fear. So all of these things kind of play in to what's going on. And so what does this mean for U.S. aquaculture in the short term? And in a few slides, in a few minutes, I'll talk a little bit about the long term and what I think is needed for growth. But what we have to step back and realize is that these sectors in aquaculture are very, very different. I chose two food fish examples on this slide, tilapia and catfish, for a reason. Most tilapia in the U.S. are sold into live food markets. And I've heard from some tilapia growers that they've been able to pass through some of their cost increases in terms of higher prices. But that's a very specialized market. If you raise catfish and other species and sell into a fillet market, you're facing a very different kind of demand. Why? For most U.S. consumers, fish is not a staple. Fish tends to be more of a luxury that you eat out on special occasions. There are lots of substitutes if you're in the fillet market. So in downturns and economic slowdowns tend to be much tougher on farm food fish than on some other kinds of things. People that go up too quickly on prices are people who are going to make another choice. They may even eat it quick fish and pick chicken or pick something else. There is a silver lining though. Even though in these conditions, there are people that have money. And so for sectors that are able to tap into those kinds of sectors, there's still money to purchase on higher price kinds of items. Now that's food fish. Now the United States, we've actually seen a lot of growth in sport fish and bait fish. And guess what? A lot of those farms are feeding catfish feeds that use a lot of soybean meal. We've seen a lot of growth over the years. It started happening before COVID and before the pandemic into recreational markets, and we've seen growth in ornamental fish sales as well that are also fed feeds that include soybean meal. Why is this happening? Especially in recent years, people tend to fish more in economic downturns. COVID saw a big increase in outdoor fishing activities. But the other reason why it's relatively easier to pass through a price increase if you're selling into a recreational market is that the end consumer of a sport fish or a bait fish is an angler. And what is an angler's biggest expense? It's going to be their bass boat. It's going to be the lures. It's going to be the fishing gear. It's not the fish. It's not the most important thing. And so it's easier to pass through, relatively easier. I shouldn't say it's easy to pass through those cost increases. Pet ownership increased with COVID. I've heard from some ornamental fish producers that things are not too bad, and things have been going fairly well in terms of market demand. So we have to look at what's going on in each specific sector, because what affects those are different. Silver lining in all of this is obviously that there have been increases in demand for these kinds of products. So I'm going to switch gears, and just these are some teasers, but understanding these markets, and we'll come back to food fish because that's the biggest sector still. We've been doing a whole series of surveys, and I'm just going to show you what they are. And if people have questions, I'm happy to come back in the Q&A. These are some of the papers that are full of a lot of details. Obviously, with a pandemic, we heard a lot of people saying a lot of things about changing seafood purchasing behavior in the United States as a response to the pandemic. We've done now 5 surveys. The first one was to look at sort of the immediate effects and changes in seafood purchasing behavior, but then we continue to do national consumer surveys quarterly, and then every 6 months, 2 years following the bulk of the economic shutdowns. So this paper goes into sort of the initial kinds of effects here. A whole other study and line of studies that's headed up by Ganesh Kumar was looking at scanner data from supermarkets that allows us to look at very broad trends across purchasing behavior by those shopping in supermarkets. And this first paper these are massive databases with a lot of detail, a lot of very specific details that we've looked at across the seafood sector. We've also looked at it by specific sectors like trout and catfish. And we're wrapping up a similar kind of analysis that's specific to oysters and also for tilapia as well. So we have a lot of data about what's happening broadly in supermarket sales of consumers. And then we've also wrapped up a survey looking at consumer preferences for marine finfish. With all the interest in expanding and investing in marine finfish production, producers are going to need to know about consumer preferences and where to go. So this is a survey asking what consumers think they would do. It's not measuring actual purchases as with the scanner data. You always have to keep that in mind. But we have data on preferences for marine finfish that have been identified by USDA as candidates for commercialization. So anybody who wants to come back and talk about these at the end, be very, very happy to do that. Quickly show you just a couple of things. We've heard a lot that people increase seafood consumption after COVID. It's not what our survey shows, and just not. Half of all the respondents reported eating the same amount of seafood after the onset of the pandemic. Ours is not the only survey to show this. There was some degree of shift between restaurant consumption and home consumption, but it's not adding up to a total increase. In fact, in this survey, 31% of respondents reported eating less seafood during the pandemic. Now, this is a national survey that was done to do this. Reasons why they ate less seafood? Well, it was the pandemic, that's what they said, but also affordability. Remember, people lost jobs, incomes were down, seafood consumption goes up when incomes go up. When incomes go down, people just can't afford it. It's too expensive. Only 19% reported increased seafood consumption during the pandemic. Interesting to me was that the main reason offered for increasing consumption was that it was healthy and good for their health, which makes a lot of sense, but not something that I necessarily expected. The scanner data project is massive with a massive data set, but what it does allow us to do is look at very broad trends. Just want to make you aware that this information is out and available. Happy to send you any amount of detail. But with this, the project team and the analyst involved is drilling down into specific cities, specific regions, into specifics in terms of the species. And there's a lot of detailed information about who's eating what, where, at least in terms of supermarket purchases. And the beauty of these data is that it's actual purchase behavior. It's not what somebody said they might do. It's what they actually did in supermarkets. And so with all of this then, what is the potential growth? And let me get back to these last couple slides of what could U.S. aquaculture be in the United States. Well, as I said, we've been surveying aquaculture producers now for 9 years, and we attempted to contact every farmer in each of these sector groups, and we had very high response rates in several. And so basically what I'm going to show you is this slide shows that as of 2018, which is when we put all of these things together and based on the census of aquaculture, U.S. aquaculture should have been about a third greater in 2018. And if you look at the growth in sectors like redfish and sturgeon and some others since then, that means 2022 would be at least a third greater, maybe more so, if it weren't for regulations that have resulted in lost sales and lost revenues, most of which are sold in the United States, is what is the market for most of our producers. Now, I don't want to go into all of the details, but when I use the word regulation, this is the lost revenue. This 470 million is how much greater U.S. aquaculture could have been in 2018 if they didn't face this convoluted regulatory framework. It's very important to understand it's not the laws. Out of the hundreds of farmers that we interviewed across all of these different studies and surveys, I don't think anyone said that they did not want laws that protected our environment. We didn't hear that from anybody, but they don't want to fill out the same form and same data 3 different times and upload it 3 different places. They don't want an inspector coming out telling them to do something, and when they do it, then they're accused of committing a felony because somebody else comes out and says that they should have done something different. This is what we hear in these surveys, and being shut out of markets for reasons that just don't make a whole lot of sense is what has contributed to all of these kinds of values. The regulatory framework in the US, when we set out on this first study, I didn't believe this. I really didn't. But after talking with literally hundreds of farmers across the United States, this is real, and this is what has to be done to get U.S. aquaculture into a growth mode. And so what are some of those things that are needed? Well, a lot of the regulatory issues grow out of misinformation. The misinformation in some cases has been disseminated deliberately by some groups that are very anti-aquaculture, small numbers of highly vocal individuals, but in other cases, people just don't know. They just don't know aquaculture, especially if they don't grow up next to a catfish farm or a baitfish farm or something like that. They just don't know. We desperately need in the United States aquaculture literacy campaigns that are not advertising campaigns, but are just distributing basic science-based information and facts about U.S. aquaculture, what it is and what it isn't. It's been especially gratifying to me to see that USDA has included this in their long-term plans, the need for educational and extension programs on aquaculture literacy. NOAA's Office of Aquaculture has it in their plans, and within NOAA, Sea Grant has it in their long-range plans to develop aquaculture literacy campaigns. But this is something that the soy producers and their associations could help with, even if it's on a specific state level or a regional level, but to help get science-based, factual, accurate information about what U.S. aquaculture is and what it isn't. The other thing is the specific issues and constraints and priority needs do vary by species and by sectors. These sectors are very diverse. They're very different, and they have different issues. But the National Aquaculture Association each year puts out a list of research priorities. And focusing on these that NAA works to compile across all U.S. aquaculture would be a real benefit. We also have in the United States regional aquaculture centers, 5 of them, that cover the entire country. Each one of those regional aquaculture centers goes through every year or two a process where they bring together all the producers in their region, not all the producers, representatives of the major sectors in their region, and they ask them what the priority needs are. And they have that discussion, and they set and put those in rank order the regional aquaculture centers fund with their limited amount of funding, maybe 2 or 3 of those top priorities. And then there are another 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 that are priority needs that the RACs just do not have funding to address. And so there's a process that is a very comprehensive process to identify these needs that happens on an ongoing basis. What's not happening is to connect those needs of unfunded projects, people like you all with the Soybean Association and others, to try to really zero in and address the specific needs of those farmers in that sector and region. And then just generally supporting U.S. aquaculture associations, the initiatives that they have in Washington and the different programs, NAA, Catfish Farmers of America, U.S. Trout Farmers, Redfish Farmers Association, finding out how soybean producers can support these would be valuable to come together and help U.S. aquaculture grow. Somebody who spends a lot of time in Washington and has for many, many years made a comment not too long ago that they have never seen so many bills in Washington right now that are supportive of aquaculture. And so there's an opportunity to get behind these bills. They're all different and they have different things, and some showed different things in another bill, but there are a lot supporting. So it shows an increased interest in helping to promote and deal with the constraints to U.S. aquaculture that need to be resolved for aquaculture to grow. Now, we've dealt for decades now. I've watched the anti-aquaculture sentiment grow. I think it's waning. I think there's increased interest. I see in surveys consumers want locally produced food. They want to connect with their producers. As I talk with young people, and it really starts with millennials on down, I see a renewed interest and a recognition on the part that aquaculture really needs to be part of a sustainable solution. It's not just the enemy that's destroying our planet. It can and should be a sustainable solution, or part of a sustainable solution to feeding our population. And that's what I hear. And so in conclusion, growth of U.S. aquaculture will stimulate demand for U.S. soybeans. And I think U.S. aquaculture is ready to do it. I see the support coming together to deal and remove these constraints that have been holding it back very much. Thank you for your attention here today. If anybody wants copies of any of the papers I talked about or other information, my email is on the screen there, and I'm happy to try and address any questions that you may have here today.
Thank you very much, Carol. Always informative, and you already have one comment, and thanks and praise from Mr. Guy Allen in the question and answers. So thank you. I apologize too. Apparently we are installing something on the ceiling or on our floor because my feet are literally shaking. So thus the headphones. So I can halfway through, it's like, oh my gosh, I can't take this anymore. So anyway, we have a few more minutes. Mac, I want to turn it over to you and just talk about, and maybe just respond to some of the information we heard on the global aquaculture and domestic aquaculture outlook, and maybe translate that to our soybean industry friends and reciprocate some of the opportunities that we're seeing coming down the pipe.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Easton, and thanks to both Dr. Engel and Dr. Garlock for fantastic presentations. I definitely walked away learning a couple things. So just by way of introduction, Mac Marshall, the Vice President of Market Intelligence for the United Soybean Board. I've been in this role for about 3 years. Prior to that, I worked for Monsanto and eventually Bayer Crop Science. And it was really interesting, particularly going through Dr. Garlock's presentation, seeing some of the history around fish meal prices, availability, shifts in wild catch versus aquaculture. Because one of the first projects I had when I worked at Monsanto was actually investigating the aquaculture market and what opportunities there might be for some of our core offerings like soy. And one of the major pain points that we recognized for the industry then was declining availability of fish meal, as well as that significant price differential between fish meal at $2,000 a metric ton and soy meal at $500 a metric ton. So, which I think brings me to the final point in Dr. Engel's slides, which was this reciprocal relationship between opportunities in domestic aquaculture and opportunities for the domestic soybean industry. And that's really where we are right now. For those of you who are on the webinar, from the soy world, you've probably heard me talk about this ad nauseum, but for everybody else, We're going through this transformative period in the United States in our domestic soybean processing industry, where we're scaling up capacity by upwards of, potentially 35% over the next couple of years. Now, this is all being driven for different reasons than for which we've historically had crushing expansion. Historically, it's been to produce more meal to go into animal agriculture. And now we're in a position where the crush expansion is happening to produce more oil. So now the meal has become a little bit of an afterthought. And as you look ahead over the next couple of years, if we have this full build out of crush capacity and see, domestic crushing go from about 60 million tons annually to, potentially 80 million tons annually, that naturally means that we're going to have, on the order of, if you believe all that, 17, 18 million incremental tons of soybean meal production in the United States, which I think is a really great thing for our partners in the animal agriculture and aquaculture, both domestically and internationally, because as you look at that build out over the next 3 years, increasing soybean meal availability, and you look at the futures curves there as well, you see this significant drop off in the expectation of where prices are going to go. Naturally, as we have more availability of soybean meal, the price is expected to moderate. And additionally, we've had some, production disruptions in major producers over the last couple of years. Argentina, this last year has had an absolutely disastrous crop, which has limited their meal exports. They're typically the #1 meal exporter. And then Brazil last year, for the prior season, had a difficult crop as well. So we've seen this elevated price level structurally, in the meal side during that period, due to just supply and demand imbalance. But over the next couple of years, futures curves are indicating that we'd have 15 to 20% decline in soybean meal pricing. So when we think about some of those very clear relationships which were illustrated in the prior presentations, that growth in industry is intrinsically tied and inextricably tied to the cost of production. So as we see costs of production being mitigated in the coming years due to declining feed costs, now really presents, I think, a grand opportunity for domestic aquaculture to expand. As we think about the initiatives that we're approaching in these coming years and really looking at from a soy-centric standpoint, there's a lot of work that we have going on the animal ag side, and we believe that we can scale up and reclaim some domestic ration share, particularly in the swine space. And of course, poultry is our biggest domestic consumer here. Even as we expand all of that, that is not going to absorb all of the incremental meal production that we're going to have in the United States. We're going to be looking for export channels as well. And the areas that I think have been most identified as the biggest opportunities are, incidentally, a lot of those heat spots that you saw on Dr. Garlock's map of where aquaculture production is centered on a global basis. Yes, there's China up there. Those are lower value species, primarily carp and everything, as previously articulated. But really, it's that Southeast Asia corridor, which does not import a lot of meal from the United States. So there's a lot of opportunity for importers there to experience that. India is an interesting case because it's a large shrimp producer when we import a lot of shrimp from India. But then, of course, also, parts of Latin America, particularly like Chile, Peru, Ecuador. These are all, burgeoning meal markets for us that have grown significantly over the last decade on the strength of aquaculture. But you put all that together, and there's still additional opportunity, I feel, just as the numbers all pencil out, for that growth domestically. I hear a figure like, hey, production could have been 30% higher than it was in an absence of some of these license to operate issues. If we were to see a 30% increase in domestic aquaculture production, I think that would be really substantial and fantastic for the soy industry as well, and as well as the opportunity for domestic aquaculture producers to be incorporating more soy meal into their rations, avoiding some of the fish meal component there, which both has its I'd say, constraints on availability, and then that naturally factors into price as well. So just I know we're limited on time, so just a couple observations, comments based on the discussion earlier today. And I see we've got a couple questions coming in the chat. So Easton, I'll turn that back over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mac. And apologies for the tight timeline, and anyone
Not
And
at
even,
all.
yeah, I know you're,
Normally I steal the microphone the whole time, so this is a little bit of turnabout is fair play. Got to be
no, it's all
efficient for
good.
once.
Well, thank you as always for joining and the insight. So we will take a moment to answer questions. So please send them in, and I actually can speak to the first one, which is, what's the soybean industry doing to improve fish feed and making soy-based feed easier for carnivorous fish to utilize plant-based feed? So we're doing a lot. Actually, it's the majority of the research that we've done over the past decade, but in particular the last year or so. All of those projects are in our most recent research report, and a lot of them, to be really honest, are wrapping up here in the next quarter. So there's going to be a lot of white papers and information on those carnivorous species, but we're working on nutritional factors, maximizing both the consumption of soy without affecting animal health, and also there's some genetics and genetic strains in those species as well. So a lot of really exciting things. Shadow, I know a lot of those researchers are here, but just to keep us moving, that's exciting. I'll also point out, if you have ideas to continue to improve that or questions to continue making soy an easier feed ingredient for carnivorous fish, please don't be bashful or share your ideas with your researcher friends. Our RFP opens in October, and then I've already taken one note of combining our RFP priorities in our advisory committee with which you shared, Carol, as far as the priorities that NAA is setting and the regional aquaculture centers are setting. So a lot of alignment happening there, which I think is fantastic. Carol, I see you're answering questions. Are there any others that you'd like to speak to?
I think I've responded. There were some questions in the chat about trout. The U.S. trout industry has been primarily constrained by regulations. They probably have some of the higher costs in terms of what we started calling thwarted expansion attempts, and we've got an entire paper on what has constrained U.S. trout production, and because of the inability to expand, the demand is there. And what we've heard from a lot of trout producers is the demand for locally produced fish is there for trout, and it's strong for trout. And so the opportunity, the markets are there. The farmers are experienced. They know how to do it. People have been attempting to expand, and they've been prevented from doing it. And they were doing it legally. They were doing it, within the entire set of regulations that exist in terms of meeting the standards and compliance and everything else, but they were still not allowed to do it. And so I'm happy to send any of those regulatory cost papers and the one on trout. So the end of the story of what's happened with trout, the demand is there. Farmers have tried to expand. They haven't been allowed to do it in the US. So we're importing trout from other countries around the world. I mean, that's what's happening. There was a question about the very high lost revenue of shellfish on the West Coast. Well, that's a very long story. Again, we have a whole paper on it that goes into it, but it has to do with delays in permitting. But in one of the states that has a big shellfish industry, is the primary regulatory agency decided to change what it was doing and to change everything. They suspended all the permits and leases for an extended period of time, and it just was devastating to any kind of business to have that kind of thing happen. And the delays in permitting are not just delays of a week or 2 or 3. We heard about delays in getting a permit of up to 10 years, even by people who met all the requirements and were told they were going to be able to go ahead, invested money in major facilities, and then ended up in a 10-year delay of getting approved for it. You can't run a business that way and do it successfully. And so those values on the West Coast are really large lost revenue values for shellfish.
Excellent. Thank you, Carol. Well, seeing no other questions and realizing we're a few minutes past our scheduled hour, I do want to just take a moment again to thank you, Mac, Carol, Karen. This has been invaluable to me. I hope it's been valuable to all of our attendees. And there's just there's so much opportunity. It's almost disappointing we haven't taken advantage of that further. But as you pointed out, I think those barriers are clear, and the opportunity is
here, not to rhyme, but we have a lot of opportunity to take advantage of. And the soybean industry, I know, is prepared, and SAA is prepared to help take advantage of that. So if any attendee has ideas to collaborate, has ideas for future webinar topics, don't be bashful. My contact information is on the screen. Or if you want any of the, to get connected to our speakers, reach out and I'll be sure to get you in touch. So with that, we will end. Thank you all. I hope to see you. We'll have another webinar in the fall. So date to be determined. Topic, I think we have a few ideas, but again, if you have any ideas, let us know and we'll be happy to do our best. But y'all have a great week. Stay safe, and thank you again for attending.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mac. Take care.
You too. Thank you.